Hey, what's going on there, guys? I'm back here today with another deck tech for you. So today we are going to be taking a look at a standard deck, and it is Bant Delver. So Bant is a color combination of blue, white, and green, and with this Delver deck we are going to be fairly tempo-oriented in that we want to beat down our opponent and get them to 0 in the early to mid-game and not let them get to their mid to late game stages in the game that we're playing and do anything big. So I've been working on this deck ever since the SCG Classic in Pittsburgh, and that was really where I saw Advent of the Wurm starting to get really good, and I wanted to play around Advent of the Wurm and also utilize Snapcaster Mage as well, just because of being able to flashback Advent of the Wurm, and I thought that what better than to play those cards in a Delver style deck. So we are going to break it down here today, but before we get to that, if you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below and I'll take them into consideration for future deck techs. So now let's jump right on into it and take a look at our creatures first. So we have Delver of Secrets being our playset here. He's a 1/1 for 1 blue, and he is one of the most fun cards to play in this deck. The deck is named after him. And at the beginning of our upkeep, we can look at the top card of our library. We can reveal that card. If it's an instant or sorcery, we get to transform him, and he transforms into a 3/2 flying creature. So we can essentially have a 3/2 flyer for 1 mana, and we're able to just bash our opponent with him, especially early game. That is really significant. We have a playset of Snapcaster Mage, so 2/1 for 2 with Flash, and whenever he enters the battlefield, target instant or sorcery card in our graveyard, it's going to gain flashback until the end of the turn, so it's going to let us flashback a variety of spells, whether it is a counter spell like Syncopate, Spell Rupture, or a spell like Advent of the Wurm, which is going to give us a 5/5 creature. We can also start flashing back our charms, which I have Simic Charm and Azorius Charm in this deck. So ultimately, Snapcaster Mage is going to allow us to utilize the spells that we've already cast, and it's going to allow us to kind of just recycle them and get some more value out of the things that we need to be playing and that we've played earlier on in the game. We also have a playset of Quirion Dryad. So she is a 1/1 for 2, 1 generic and 1 green, and whenever we cast a white, blue, black, or red spell, put a +1/+1 counter on the Dryad. So with the Dryad actually gets really big really quick, just because of all of the different spells that we have. Now, of course, she's not going to get bigger off of green spells, but if you look at all the things that we're actually playing in the deck, and if you look at the list, she is going to get bigger off of pretty much everything that we're playing, because it also is going to share another color if it's already green, like the Advent of the Wurm or the Simic Charm. It's green, but it's also white, and the Simic Charm is green and also blue, so we get to play off of that and make the Quirion Dryad a lot bigger. And up against a lot of different decks, the Dryad ends up just being a huge bomb. If your opponent doesn't deal with it, if they don't find removal for it early on, it just ends up being a nuisance for them, and they have to deal with it. And especially playing the Dryad up against aggro, once it gets big enough, it's just a huge threat, and it can just sit there on the field and not let your opponent swing in with smaller creatures. I also have 1 Talrand Sky Summoner in the main board. Now, Talrand is more so geared for the slower matchups than anything else. The slower mid-range and the control decks are what I like to have him in for. So I have 1 in the main board, 1 in the sideboard. For the slower matchups, I sat in 1 more, but just having him as a 1-of in the main board is pretty fine. He is another one of those cards that is a threat, because if your opponent doesn't deal with him, because our deck is so filled with instants and sorceries, we can start making 2/2s pretty easily. So whenever we cast an instant or a sorcery spell, put a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Not bad at all, especially up against these slower matchups. We have a playset of Simic Charm. So Simic Charm is really good in this deck, and before I would be playing like Unsummon, but now since Gatecrash came out, Simic Charm is just really good. In the previous seasons where I was playing Simic Delver and Bug Delver, I didn't really utilize Simic Charm enough, and that was like a big mistake. The more I played with it, I started to realize how good Simic Charm really is. So we can give a target creature +3/+3 until the end of the turn, so that's fairly relevant. It's a giant growth. We can give permanents we control hexproof until the end of the turn, so if our opponent's using any type of removal, if it's like removal heavy, like Jund midrange, if it's like one of those decks where they have just tons of things that can answer our creatures, we can have Simic Charm, keep mana open after playing a creature and assure that it stays and sticks around. And we can also return target creature card to its owner's hand. So we have the unsummon, we have a giant growth, and we can make our permanents hexproof. So ultimately, Simic Charm ends up being really nice for us. All three modes are completely and entirely relevant, and I use all three modes in various matchups. So Simic Charm, definitely really important, and really important as a playset. I have 3 Azorius Charms. Now, with the Azorius Charm, I cycle it more than anything just because it's a really nice way to draw and just keep on drawing and digging for more things, more land drops or more spells that I want to be casting. But we can also give our creatures lifelink if we want, and we can get back a pretty decent chunk of life if we have big enough creatures. We can also go and return target attacking or blocking creature to the top of its owner's library, so that's also fairly relevant for us. So ultimately, with the Azorius Charm, we are going to be using all 3 modes. If the situation arises, we can kind of bounce back and forth between the ones that we want to use. Not as much as Simic Charm, I would say. I think the implications are a little bit less broad for when you're going to be using them, but the Azorius Charm is still really good, and it definitely does help us out in a lot of different situations that could come up. We also have a 3 of for Syncopate here, so instant speed, counter spell for X and 1 blue, counter target spell unless its controller pays X amount of mana. If it's countered that way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So with Syncopate, it's kind of the closest thing that we can get to Mana Leak without it being Mana Leak. Mana Leak was really good for Delver whenever it was still in Standard, and it was a consistent spell that Delver had where for 2 mana you could counter a spell unless its controller is going to pay 3, so it was just consistent all the way through. Syncopate's a little bit different. Sometimes you have to put in a little bit more for the X value to be able to counter things efficiently. Your opponent may leave mana open, and if you're playing up against like control, it may be a little bit more difficult to counter things that they're playing. But Syncopate is definitely still really good. You can still start countering things even if the X value is 1 or 2. Sometimes you have to go a little bit bigger and go for 3. But ultimately, Syncopate's a really good counterspell for us. I also have Spell Rupture in here as well. So, again, Spell Rupture, I think, is a little bit less valuable for us than Syncopate if our opponent has removal for our creatures. But if our opponent can't effectively remove our creatures from the board, Spell Rupture ends up being a little bit better than Syncopate because we don't have to put in any more mana than 2 to actually be able to counter things. So Spell Rupture counters target spell unless its controller pays X, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. So if we have a flip Delver, they're going to have to pay 3. If our Dryads are really huge, they're going to have to pay whatever the highest power is on the Dryad. But ultimately, Spell Rupture is another one of those ways where we just have the outlet to counter things, and it doesn't have a drawback. It's not very specific. It's not specific to creatures, or it's not specific to non-creature spells or anything like that. I also have 2 Sphinx's Revelation. So Sphinx's Revelation originally started off as Think Twice, and then I started getting into more of the mid-range and the control matchups where I would have these situations where Sphinx's Revelation would do me so much better, even if it was an X value of 3 or 4, that's still better than what I would have been playing with the Think Twice and playing off of that. So Sphinx's Revelation is something that I worked into the deck as I started testing more with it, but you don't get as high of an X value as you would with playing a control deck or playing something that's more mid-range oriented. But even still in this deck, it's another outlet where we play against the slower matchups, and the Sphinx's Revelation lets us dig. Even against some of the aggro matchups, if we still have it in, which I almost always keep it in no matter what, but even against some of those aggro matchups, gaining back even a little bit of life when we have the mana open is going to be pretty nice for us. So I have the Sphinx's Revelation more so for digging than gaining life, but it's kind of reversible there, where it's going to help us in both situations, but it's not going to help us a huge ton like it would control. I also have 2 Midnight Hauntings, so Instant speed, 3 cost, and it puts 2 1/1 White Spirit creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield. Midnight Haunting is really great whenever we start getting into the matchups where we need to start wrathing and we can't really effectively keep creatures on the board. Midnight Haunting is going to be one of those easy ways where we pay 3 mana. If we can throw Runechanter's Pike onto it, it ends up being really awesome for us. So the Midnight Haunting was just another way of being able to create creatures, and the evasion was pretty much the most important and key thing there, where I could just have evasion creatures that if I can throw the Pike onto it and have enough instants and sorceries in the graveyard, then I could effectively swing for a lethal, maybe not in 1 turn, but in the course of like 2 or 3 turns. So that was the logic behind the Midnight Haunting, and it's been working out very well. I have the playset of Advent of the Wurm, my favorite card in this deck aside from Delver. Delver's really awesome, but Advent of the Wurm is just really sick. It's an instant speed card for 4 mana, 1 generic, double green, 1 white, and we get to put a 5/5 Wurm token with trample onto the battlefield. So having a 5/5 with trample is really nice, especially if we can throw Runechanter's Pike on it. That's probably like my favorite thing to do with the 5/5s, just because we can turn it into a 8 to 10 power creature really, really easily. And that's something that is just going to be really huge and immense. I really love that. And having it at an instant speed is also really awesome too, just because if our opponent has the means of wrathing us, if they have like Supreme Verdict or Terminus or something like that, we can still cast Advent of the Wurm at the end of their turn and get our 5/5 out there. So Advent is one of those cards that is really troublesome for a lot of people. I have 1 Rapid Hybridization, so it lets us destroy a creature. It can't be regenerated, and its controller gets a 3/3 Frog Lizard creature token onto the battlefield. So with the Rapid Hybridization, this was more so something of a removal card where I can start dealing with things that I normally couldn't deal with at an instant speed. Things like Sire of Insanity, also Olivia Voldaren, and there are just like so many things. Even Angel of Serenity, whenever it comes in, we can deal with it before it exiles things underneath it. So we can respond to the targets being declared, and we can effectively exile and keep exiled all the things that our opponent's targeting without them coming back to their hands. So that was a kind of a nice trick and means of using the Rapid Hybridization. But mainly the hybridization was just being able to get rid of creatures that I couldn't usually deal with at an instant speed. I also have 1 more in the sideboard whenever I start playing up against some gritty matchups like Jund midrange, where I want to be getting rid of their Sire of Insanity, especially if I have a lot of high value cards in my hand. Sometimes if they play it, it might not be as significant for me to use hybridization, so I let them discard my hand and their hand as well. But if I have a lot of high value in my hand, I'm going to go for the hybridization and give them a 3/3, because I'd rather deal with a 3/3 than Sire of Insanity being on the board. I also have 2 Supreme Verdicts, so this is to wrath the board, especially up against aggro matchups. I still have 2 of them in the main board, 2 of them in the sideboard. I side in 2 more up against aggro, but having 2 of them in the main board is pretty nice just to kind of be well prepared. Even if we have a game 1 where it's kind of going rough for us, being able to draw into Supreme Verdict is pretty nice. If we're playing up against a matchup like Control where Supreme Verdict isn't going to be relevant, it's just going to be a dead spell for us game 1, but then we side it out for other more relevant things game 2. But with how the meta's been going so far, I still wanted to have the 2 Supreme Verdict in the main board just in case I play against anything that is creature-oriented, just to have that wrath for them. And then I had the 2 Runechanter's Pike, so Runechanter's Pike, 2 cost equipment, 2 to equip, and the equipped creature is going to get First Strike and plus X+O, where X is the number of instants and sorcery cards in our graveyard. So those are the spells and the creatures and the equipments that we have now. For the mana base, I have a playset of Breeding Pool, a playset of Hallowed Fountain, a playset of Temple Garden, so those are the shocks that we have. For the other dual lands, I have a playset of Hinterland Harbor, 3 Glacial Fortress, and 2 Sunpetal Grove, so they kind of scaled down from there, and 1 singleton Moorland Haunt. So the Moorland Haunt is for the matchups that kind of take a while to actually pull off a win out of them, and if our opponent's getting rid of our creatures and stuff, we can use the Moorland Haunt, exile the creature cards from our graveyard, and make 1/1s with flying. So it gives us targets for our Runechanter Spike. So that's the main board that we have. Now let's switch over and take a look at what I'm using in the sideboard here. So for our sideboard here, we're starting off with the 1 singleton Negate. So with Negate, we counter target non-creature spell for 1 generic and 1 blue. Negate's really awesome for any matchups that have a lot of non-creature spells. So the flash variants like USA Flash, control decks in any various colors and color combinations, and also mid-range decks. Generally, the more slower matchups are going to be playing more non-creature spells. So we want to side in the Negate when we can also give it flashback off of Snapcaster Mage, giving us 2 uses out of it. I have 2 Garruk Relentless. So Garruk Relentless is awesome for both aggro and control. Up against aggro, Garruk is going to be plopping out 2/2s, and with the amount of board wipes that we have 5 total, 2 Supreme Verdicts in the main board, 2 Supreme Verdicts in the sideboard, and 1 Terminus. So when we start using a lot of board wiping, we can't consistently keep creatures on our side of the board either. But Garruk Relentless makes it nice because even post-Wrath, we can start making 2/2s that are either going to be chump blockers and are going to stall until we get another board wipe against our opponent, or he is going to let us fill the board with attackers and ways of beating down our opponent and killing them. Up against control, it's just another threat that they have to deal with. We can kind of be a little bit more cautious with our creatures because our opponent may have board wiping elements like Supreme Verdict. So we can keep our creatures back. We can cast Garruk Relentless. If he resolves, we can make 2/2s with him. So if our opponent doesn't deal with him immediately, he's going to fill the board with a lot of 2/2s, so they have to Wrath at that point. And they also still have to deal with Garruk Relentless, so they're going to have to dedicate 2 means of getting rid of our board and our creatures, and also getting rid of him. And it allows us to keep back our creatures after they deal with him, after they commit their resources to getting rid of him. Then we can start playing our creatures. We can play a little bit less cautiously, and we can kind of play into more aggressive strategies. I have 1 Naturalize in the deck as well. So the Naturalize originally started off as Ray of Revelation, and then I started running into the awkward situation where sometimes I would be playing against an opponent and they would have Grafdigger's Cage. So the Grafdigger's Cage didn't allow me to play with my graveyard and play with Snapcaster Mage, so it made Snapcaster Mage really unimpressive. And also, some of the Jund decks were running Staff of Nim, so I wanted to be able to get rid of that with Naturalize as well. But that's the biggest reason why I wanted to run Naturalize over Ray of Revelation. Naturalize still gets rid of all the things that we want, it just doesn't have a flashback, which is alright because we can still flash it back with Snapcaster Mage easily. So whether it's like Assemble the Legion, Detention Sphere, Oblivion Ring if our opponent's playing it, we can get rid of all those things. Ground Seal as well. If our opponent's trying to keep us from playing around our graveyard, not being able to target our graveyard. So Naturalize is good for that. I think the biggest thing is probably Assemble the Legion and Detention Sphere. I have 1 Talrand Sky Summoner, like I mentioned when we were talking about the main board. I have the 1 Talrand in the main board, 1 in the sideboard, and he sides in for the slower matchups. I want to have him there. He's another threat, and with the amount of instants and sorceries that we have, even if we're cycling Azorius Charms or doing other things, he's just going to be making 2/2s. He fills the board really easily up against slow decks. Then I have 1 Jace Memory Adept. So Jace is a 5-cost Planeswalker, and up against the really slow decks, the control decks, this is where I want to be siding him in. For his 0 ability, he lets us mill our opponent for 10. They have to take the top 10 cards of their library and put them into their graveyard. So with those control matchups, we want to constantly push out threats and push out things that our opponent has to deal with. So we can kind of beat them from 2 ends, where we can either go really aggressive and our opponent has to deal with our board, or we can just go with Jace Memory Adept and try to mill them out and get them to 0 cards in their deck and win off of that. Ultimately, because we just keep on pushing and playing threats, our opponent only has so many things. They only have so many Detention Spheres they can use, and usually they're not going to be playing a full playset of them. So ultimately, we can kind of get there with one thing or another. So Jace is just one of those cards where it's another thing that we can win the game with. I have 2 Voice of Resurgence for the control matchups, and sometimes the mid-range matchups as well. I don't find myself setting him in as much for the mid-range matchups, but for control, he's definitely really awesome. So whenever an opponent casts a spell during your turn, or whenever the Voice of Resurgence is put into our graveyard, we get a green and white elemental creature token with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures we control. So if our opponent is playing control and they start using things like Think Twice during our turn or Azorius Charm to cycle it to draw, we are going to be rewarded for that, and they're going to be punished a little bit. It's not foolproof. It's not like, all right, we drop Voice of Resurgence and we auto-win or anything like that. Far from it, but it makes our opponent play a little bit differently. So I like the Voice of Resurgence for that, and it's resilient. It gives us a creature even if we get Wrathed or even if the Voice of Resurgence dies. So it's just another target that we can throw like Runechanter's Pike onto, and Runechanter's Pike is something that I really love playing in this deck. So the Voice is really awesome for the control matchup. I have 3 Purify the Grave up against the graveyard-based decks, anything that's trying to play off of their graveyard. We can exile target card from a graveyard for 1 white, and we can flash it back for 1 white as well. So this over, like, Rest in Peace, we're still playing things from our graveyard. We're playing off of Runechanter's Pike, and we're flashing back things with Snapcaster, so we definitely don't want to play Rest in Peace. And with Purify the Grave, because we can use it 2 times for each copy that we have, it's going to synergize with Quirion Dryad. So the Dryad gets bigger with each Purify the Grave that we successfully are going to be able to cast. So we get to start getting rid of things from our opponent's graveyard, and we also make our Dryad bigger if we have one out on the board. Then we have 1 Terminus, so putting all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries for 6 mana, Miracle cost for 1 white, and 2 Supreme Verdicts. So Supreme Verdict can't be countered, destroy all creatures for 4 mana. I like the Terminus a little bit more for the matchups where our opponent's playing things like Strangleroot Geist and Voice of Resurgence, those types of aggro decks. I like it for that just because it doesn't say that they die. You put them on the bottom of their owner's libraries. Of course, this is going to inhibit us just a little bit if we have our own creatures, just because they don't go to the graveyard. We can't use Moorland Haunt, but ultimately up against those aggro decks, Terminus is just perfectly fine. We can manage with our creatures going to the bottom of our library and not being able to use Moorland Haunt. We just get more value out of playing the Terminus. And the last card that we have is Rapid Hybridization. So with Rapid Hybridization, we destroy target creature, can't be regenerated, they get a 3/3. So basically what we talked about in the main board, I like siding it in to be able to get rid of creatures. It's a removal spell for big creatures with big abilities and big things that they can do. Sire of Insanity, Angel of Serenity, Olivia Voldaren. Those are the 3 big targets that I have painted with the Rapid Hybridization. Those are the 3 things that I really like to hit into and just give my opponent a 3/3. Just a plain 3/3. I'm perfectly fine with dealing with that rather than annoying Olivia Voldarens that can take my creatures, Sires that make me discard, or Angel of Serenities that my opponent could potentially loop. So I want to get rid of nuisance cards and have a outlet for 1 blue to be able to destroy them. So that is the main board and the sideboard for Bant Delver. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and this breakdown of what I'm playing for this deck. The entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out. If you have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see on the channel, please leave them down in the comments below. And remember to like this video and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. Until next time, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day. Peace out.